Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful introduction. I've spent almost 50 years as a Wampanoag historian, and have learned a lot of things that were surprising to me, disturbing. Some of the things that I'm going to share with you today are you probably have never heard or even imagined that this is part of the history. And what I want to say about history is that, we all hear about American history, and then you hear about Native American history like it's something on the side, or Black history, or Asian history. But this is all actually one history, okay? And they all sort of, feed in together. And what I'm about to say to you is really the foundations of American history, because Plymouth is where American history, one of the major places that it began. I'll phrase it that way. And with the Pilgrims arriving here in 1620, there's never really any background given as to, other than their quest for religious freedom, but there's no other background given as to why they chose to come to this country. Or the fact that they were coming into the land of nations and many nations of people. That part is just somehow conveniently left out. And there are specific reasons for that. So I'm going to recount some of this history, and it can be a little difficult, so I'm just warning you. And I say this because this is history that people need to know. I feel that people need to know, because it's like, if you have all the facts, then you can make a decision. But otherwise, if you don't have all the facts, you're operating, you're not functioning as well as you could be. And I always take history back to the doctrine of discovery, and most people have never heard of that. And what has become known as the doctrine of discovery was really a series of bulletins that were issued by the Vatican in the 14th and 15th centuries. And there was one in particular in 1452 that was issued by Pope Nicholas, which stated that Christian people could go into the lands of non-Christians and take over their lands, take over all the resources of the land. They could enslave the people or even kill them, because non-Christians were considered not even to be human, okay? And to me, that's sort of, we can, of course, go back to how everything scrolled up to arrive at the doctrine of discovery, but that's usually as far back as I go, because in 1452, what was almost the next thing to happen? We have Columbus sailing in 1492, 40 years later. And a lot of people don't know about Columbus, but over the course of his voyages into the Caribbean and the islands down there, he and his crew were responsible for the deaths of some 60 million people because they were not Christian. And I think Columbus, swore. He was informed that there was gold down there. And one of the things he used to do was they enslaved the native people of those areas, and they had a quota. They were supposed to bring in so much gold, every day. And I don't think the gold was there to bring in, and so they would have their hands cut off. So we are not talking about a very pretty history, okay? And in 1492, it's 120 years later, 130 years later, the Pilgrims come in, and the way I look at it is that Columbus opened this age of exploration. He opened that doorway. And even for 100 years before the Pilgrims settled in 1620, there were ships coming back and forth from Europe, from many countries, Spain, England, France, Holland. They were looking to trade with native people. They were looking to explore. And the translation of that word is looking for a place to establish a colony. And we'll talk about what that means in a moment. They were also looking to fish, but they were coming over in the summer. And the first recorded ship to come to this area was in 1524. Okay, that was Verrazzano, Giovanni da Verrazzano, and he had some interaction with the Narragansett Indians in what is now Rhode Island, and 1524 is, 32 years after Columbus. So you can see the progression here. And prior to the Pilgrims coming here and settling, there was a ship that had come to what is now southern Maine, and they left 2 men with the indigenous people up there, one of whom died right away, and it seems like the other one was sick. And then all of a sudden, there's a huge plague that developed, and it just swept right down the coast until it hit Patuxent, or what is now Plymouth, and then it turned inland and stopped at Narragansett Bay. So that plague affected 4 different tribal nations, one of whom was the Wampanoag, and we lost 75 to 90% of our entire population during that 2-year span. And the Wampanoag people originally, our territory extended from the Merrimack River to the north, to the Concord River to the west, down to Narragansett Bay, and including the Cape and the islands. And within that area, at least this far south in Plymouth area, we lost 75 to 90% of our population. We estimate that because within the area originally, there were 69 villages with an average of 1,000 people per village. Okay, so a conservative population estimate was 70,000 people. So we may have lost 55,000 people in that 2-year span. And this plague was always interpreted as being inadvertent. Just, these 6 sailors came over and they just happened to infect the people up in southern Maine, and then the thing went like wildfire, there you go, wildfire, right down the coast. But recently I was rereading a passage from John Smith's writings, and he's talking about the onset of that particular epidemic. And, these 2 men that were left ashore, the one that survived was, trying to talk about Christianity. I don't think he was a preacher, but he was talking about Christianity and, in the hopes of converting the Indian people of the area. And they were like, in his words, they were mocking him and deriding him. And I say in his words because I'm wondering, how true that actually is. And I think he was saying things to people that just had never been in their reality. So your first reaction is like, what are you talking about? But because of their mocking him, he said that, that his God could come and wipe out all of their people. He was that powerful. All of a sudden, here comes this plague. And I read that and I'm like, maybe it wasn't so inadvertent after all. Very convenient that 2 years before the Pilgrims come, that the whole area is cleared out. And John Smith and other people are writing about how it was cleared for a better people, and their bodies were lay like dung upon the earth, and all other sorts of not very complimentary things to the deaths of these tens of thousands of people. And as I was saying a few moments ago, this is all part of American history. This is the part that isn't told, because it isn't very pretty. And all that I would ask of listeners is that you hear this so that you know the history. I'm not standing here to blame anybody or make anybody feel guilty, because to me those are useless efforts. We go nowhere. We can't go forward. with a blame game, or someone's, wallowing in guilt and pity, self-pity. That gets us nowhere. But we can't keep spinning our wheels with the happy first Thanksgiving story, because that's not true. Okay, largely, that story is mythology, and and it sets the tone for, the treatment that other Native people received as colonization and westward expansion, went across the country. So, and the Pilgrim settling, I don't think that action is given the credit that it's really due, because to me, that was a world-changing thing that happened. Because once they settled and got established, that opened the door. It was 10 years later in 1630 when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established in what is now Boston, and there were thousands of people coming in from Europe, shipload after shipload. And at the same time, there was like an epidemic a decade throughout the 17th century. And and I think, the indigenous people that were left, whether Wampanoag or Massachusetts or Narragansett or whomever, we just got, it was like a tsunami. We got, overwhelmed with numbers. And a lot of our people tried to learn English ways, like reading and writing. Harvard established the Indian College in 1650, to which only a handful of Native students went. And I've had people say, oh, wasn't it wonderful that Caleb Chisha Tiamak, he was the one person, he was from Aquinnah, go Aquinnah, to graduate at all. Because there were three people that died, and one person quit school and returned to his home. He was a Nipmuc man, James Printer. And then Caleb graduated, but he died a year later. And three of them, including Caleb, died because of the conditions in the school were so, detrimental to your physical health, and then the diet was poor, and they literally were dying of consumption and malnutrition and things like that. But I had a person say to me once, isn't it wonderful that this Wampanoag man went through Harvard and got a degree? For what purpose? He graduated in 1665. He'd grown up as a hunter and a fisherman and a forager. His people farmed, my people farmed. We knew how to live with the earth. We knew how to respect the earth. And that's something that people still don't get, because that ingrained stereotype of backward primitive people, these non-Christian primitive Indians, just scooting over the landscape. And it has escaped people that, at the time of European settlement here, a lot of the English writers were talking about how this land looked like paradise. It looked like Eden, because there were huge forests, vast forests, old-growth trees that were 6 feet or more in diameter. They reached a height of 100 feet or more. The waters were pristine. The sky was clean. The soil, the earth was clean. I worked at what is now Plymouth, Patuxet for many years, and would often tell people, or they would ask, how long did Wampanoag people live? And they expected to hear an answer of like 35 to 40 years, or something limited like that, because of our backward primitive ways. And I would say, oh, well, we lived to be 70, 80 years old. It wasn't uncommon for people to reach 100, because you read about that. And people were shocked. How could we possibly live that long given our backward and primitive lifestyle? Hint number one, maybe the lifestyle wasn't so backward and primitive. And early on, I used to have to really, I hadn't done any research into that to answer that question, so I'm really reaching into my repertoire of interpretive material, and I'm like, well, You know, the water was clean, the earth was clean, the air was clean. So our food was clean. You know, the water that we drank was clean. Well, and I wasn't too far off the mark, because that is the answer. That's how we lived that long. And we didn't have, we certainly didn't have the infectious diseases that were coming over here from Europe. And we didn't have a lot of disease anyway because of our lifestyle. And the reason that the earth looked like it did, with the vast forests and all of it, that wasn't happenstance either. That was based on our system of values and how we relate to the earth. And we had maintained that for a minimum of 10,000 years. You know, scientists want to put us being here since the end of the last ice age, 10 to 14,000 years ago. We've been here at least that long. And we nurtured the earth. We had certain practices like burning our cornfields or burning the underbrush and managing, if you will, the landscape. But we did it in a way that not only was beneficial to us as humans to fulfill our needs for living, but it was beneficial to the environment. Nothing was done without careful thinking and reflection, you know, as to what are the long-term consequences, which, you know, is so different from today's society, because it's like, oh, we'll do this. And then it messes up the water or the air or the whatever, and then you got to think of a way to fix it, which is becoming nigh impossible. So there's a lot of history out there. The whole thing with colonization. A lot of times, you know, I've asked people, give me a definition of the word colonization or colony. Oh, well, that's when people come here from another country and they start living here and make their homes and they live in another country now. Is that it? Yep. Nope, it isn't. Because when you colonize, that means you are taking over someone else's country. And by and large, I don't know of any race or culture or nationality of people that has liked being colonized, so they tend to resist. And so it also involves the domination and control of those people or their annihilation, whichever works best. That's just part and parcel. You know, that is just the history that has happened in this country. And that's the reality. A lot of times people will say to me, oh, well, that's just your perspective. And I'm like, I'm not telling you my perspective. I'm just telling you what happened. Okay? This is what happened. I'm more than glad to give my perspective on it, but that's a whole different thing. And with the colonization, you know, colonization's like an octopus with 16 or 32 legs or something, not just 8, because it comes at you from every direction and has many manifestations in the way that it worked, the way that it did dominate and control and take over the land. Disease was one of them, as we've talked about. Slavery. The slavery started here, you know, prior to the Pilgrims settling, when European sea captains were grabbing people from coastal tribes, taking them back to England or Spain, Squanto being one of the most famous, because it always say in the books, oh, Squanto spoke English. And a lot of times it doesn't say, like, how did this particular Wampanoag man come to speak English? Well, that's because he was kidnapped, taken to Spain, sold into slavery, and 5 years later, long story short, managed to make his way back here. Okay, and he became the interpreter for the Pilgrims. But slavery was something that was done wholesale. It actually did begin here. The Pilgrims were involved in the slave trade. King Philip's War, at the end of King Philip's War in 1676, shiploads of Wampanoag, Narragansett, Pequot, Mohegan, Nipmuc people were just sent out of this country down to the Caribbean just to get Indians out of here, literally. Okay? And the way things go, you know, what goes around comes around, and we have connected with people down from Bermuda and from Barbados, I'm not sure about other of the islands, but who know that they come from here. And sometimes people have this history in their family or in their community of being knowledge that they're Wampanoag or Narragansett or a specific tribe, and sometimes they don't, because just depending on the family, their history just gets lost. People were made to be ashamed of being Indian. And so, you tend not to teach your kids when you're in that mental state. But yet we've made this connection, and that's been close to 40 years now. And it's been wonderful. And it's like every year a group of folks come up from Bermuda to our powwows, and they have a powwow now every 2 years, and we have folks from here that go down. And so we have friends, we have family, we have relationships again with these folks. I look at that as like, you can't keep a good womp down, so that's just that. So, colonization has had such devastating effects and just torn apart our communities. Early on in the 1660s, Mashpee, Aquinnah, other places as well, were established as praying towns. They were two of our original villages that became praying towns, that became reservations, okay? And these are all ways of getting land. Because on a reservation, you're moving people up to one place. You're moving out of one place to another place to get them away from where the English people wanted to live. And they were just, on this reservation. But on the reservation, they were allotting land. The General Court of Massachusetts was allotting land like 60 acres per family. And what that did was just overturn, it just flipped our whole traditional land use patterns. So we could not relate to the land anymore the way that we had for centuries and centuries. In the Wampanoag language, the word for land is ahki. And there's a thing called noun possession. I'm not a linguist, and I'm not even sure I understand this well enough to articulate it, but there's something called noun possession. So I can't just use the word ahki. I have to say whose land. So, and if I were to say my land, there's an N prefix, or NU. But because you don't want to have an NUA, there's a T put in there just to make it an easier pronunciation. So you would say Nataki. But then that word also is not complete. And you usually see it with an M on the end, the suffix of an M. So you have Natakim. And what that M signifies is that me and my land cannot be separated from each other. We are one thing. We're one thing. We're inseparable. We're inalienable from each other. Okay? On the back of my jacket, I'll show it off. It says, Nutomas Aquinahanat, which means I'm from Aquinnah. And Nutomas doesn't just mean I come from this, I live here, whatever. It actually means, when you break the word down linguistically, that my DNA comes from Aquinnah. As in, like, me and the land are one thing. The people and the land are one. And I don't know if you've ever seen the film We Still Live Here, which was done by Anne Makepeace, and that came out, I think, in 2011, but it's getting to be, it's still a wonderful film, one of the best things that was done on Wampanoag people, and it's about the founding of the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project, so well worth watching. And it's available, I think it's available from Anne Makepeace's website, or I don't know if you can get it on Amazon or whatever. But that is very important because in the 17th century and into the mid-18th century, a lot of, as I said, people learned to read or write, and not because they were assimilating and wanting to be like the English, but they understood that this was a way that we can combat what is happening to our land and our culture by learning, how these people are taking it away from us. So people learned to read and write, and in the Wampanoag language, they were writing wills and deeds and letters and petitions and all sorts of documents like that. And it's one of the ways we were able to reclaim our language. But what is a very sad thing to me is that by the mid-18th century, you begin to see that M suffix being dropped off the words that it normally was used on. So much of our land was being taken away and fenced off or made into private property that we had no access to it anymore, unless you get arrested for trespassing or whatever. And so that's when people really began to realize that we could be separated. So to me, that was like a very sad day in Wampanoag history. So I was talking about, reservation and the land allotments, which, broke up our land use patterns. And a lot of times, like Mashpee and Aquinnah, they were relatively left alone, at least for a period of time, late 19th century into the early 20th century. And because the whole reservation period here, if you will, went from like in the 1660s to 1870. Both Mashpee and Aquinnah were then made into towns, okay, against the wishes of each of the respective tribal people. And because in a town, anybody can come in and buy or sell land. That was the whole deal. Prior to that, in the reservation times, there were colonial laws that talked about if a white person wanted to buy land from an Indian, they had to get a license from the court, and if they didn't get such license, then the land would revert to the country. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. You'd kind of think logically that if the white person didn't get the license, that the land would just stay with the Indian person, but no, it reverts to the country, which is, either America, whether colonial or subsequent. So there was like a million ways of taking the land, and both Mashpee and Aquinnah still have these issues today. It just keeps on going. The gift, the not gift that keeps on taking or whatever. So that in a nutshell is, a little snippet of the history. Two books that I could recommend, both by Lisa Brooks, who's Abenaki. Her first book is called The Common Pot, and that's sort of a general history of the colonial era from an indigenous perspective. So it's very different from other sources that you might read. The other of her books is called Our Beloved Kin, and it's really a history of King Philip's War, but she starts back in 1620. Okay, because that kind of is when it happened, because by the time Philip became the sachem of Pokanoket and tried to rally people to, in an effort to push the English back across the water, it was almost too little too late. But I will close it there. I hope that you can watch the film I've recommended and get a hold of these two books. Please do not read, maybe I'm doing a bad thing here, I don't know, but don't read Philbrick's Mayflower or anything by Silverman, David Silverman. They don't do a good job. So, thank you.